We began our semester thinking about ideology. According to James Kavanaugh, ideology supports economic systems by teaching subjects how to think about the world. We have thought about how the school story is a potent transmitter of ideology, one that is especially powerful because its intended audience is children who are still learning the ideological tenets of their society. If we think about the stories we've read this semester, we can see the school story evolving from its beginnings in Sarah Fielding's set of connected stories, The Governess. This novel, published in 1749, apparently offers some anodyne lessons. Don't fight, girls. Seek virtue, girls. But of course there are other aspects, meant to be invisible to readers in that everyone knows that kind of way, that give us insights into the ideology and thus the economic system of the day. First, we might note that the economy must be predicated on imperialism. Jenny Peace is at school because her parents are dead, and her aunt, her guardian in their absence, is in the Caribbean seeing to her plantations. In other words, Jenny's aunt's income derives from a distant holding in a far-off and exotic location, an income made possible by Britain's colonial enterprise, and built, of course, on the backs of slaves who do the actual work on the plantation, but who are invisible in the story. Fielding's novel takes up the issue of whether it is moral to read children's stories that are merely entertaining, a question that matters to her as she writes one of the first books ever published for children's entertainment. But it utterly fails to see the enslaved people whose labor provides the comfortable living of British children, let alone to question the morality of that arrangement. Second, we might note that something must be happening vis-a-vis women's role in the economy at the time the book is written. Nancy Armstrong has argued that the rise of the domestic novel in the 18th century coincides with a new role for middle-class women, a role necessitated by the demands of industrial capitalism. At a time when newly wealthy men were presenting idle wives as a signifier of their status, women's value began to be seen as primarily about the virtue they brought to relations between people. Specifically, capitalism with its harsh and inhuman demands, its alienation of workers from their products, required a separation of spheres, so that the home, ruled by women, was seen as a haven outside the cruel demands of the materialistic world of business and industry. In The Governess, the girls are at school principally to learn morality, which we can discern from the fact that the only lessons we observe in the book are those moral lessons the girls teach each other outside the classroom. School is also figured as a temporary location for them, a place they long to leave as they return home. This posits home as the natural location for girls, another ideological message. Compare how school is imagined for boys. For them, school is where friends are. School is where fun is. In The Magnet, Munter does everything he can to avoid going home, and even the boys with more normal attitudes, such as Wharton, actually spend relatively little time at home over the holidays, really just long enough to pop in for Christmas dinner before decamping to Bob Cherry's house. And even if Wharton didn't have the invitation to Bob's, he would have been left alone shortly after Christmas as his aunt and uncle leave for the seaside. So home for girls is natural and desirable, school a temporary location that can be pleasant, but should be only used as a last resort. Remember, most of the girls in The Governess are orphans or half-orphans. But school for boys is the natural location, the place where they can practice the skills they will need in the world outside. Tom Brown, published in 1857, reflects a different economy, one that has developed from the economy of the mid-18th century. Tom is a boy who does not have to make his own way in the world. As the eldest son of a landed gentleman, whose family seat is an ancient establishment, Tom never has to wonder what he will do when he grows up. He will be the squire, like his father. Tom's academic schooling is not very important, because he's never going to have to make his way in the world. Instead, he is going to have to govern prudently and reasonably, knowing when to overlook faults or to help lame dogs over stiles, and when to crack down with the righteous hand of justice. When his father hopes that he will return from school a brave, helpful, truth-telling Englishman and gentleman and Christian, he is hoping for attributes that will assist his son in this endeavor. Note that the status of a property-owning hereditary ruler is asserted as naturally just and right. Tom leaves Rugby as a true gentleman, capable of stepping into his father's shoes when needed, and the book understands this as the right and natural state of things. Tom has no other ambitions, and he doesn't need them. He is fundamentally unimaginative, but the book understands the Browns' little corner of the world to be essentially unchanging, and the values of a gentleman like Tom Brown to be eternal. If we compare Eric, published the very next year, we see what England and school looks like from the point of view of people without ancient estates who perform the work of imperial Britain in India. Eric's family has no fixed abode. They rent a house in England when they return for a year's leave. Eric has spent most of his life away from his parents, who put him on a boat to England in the care of strangers when he was 4, and who has subsequently lived with an aunt and grown-up cousin. Eric's job is to navigate the world of school so that he can make his own way in the world, and he has a way to make. Unlike Tom, but like Mr. Williams, Eric will have to work for wages, probably in the Indian civil service like his father. Eric's failure to grasp the complex social situations of the school predict his eventual failure to understand and manipulate the complex world outside of school. While Farrer sees these challenges in terms of Manichaean choices between good and evil, he nevertheless presents a school in which Eric faces a series of opportunities to fit in with other boys, a skill that the Empire views as important. And wholly in line with imperial thinking, Farrer argues early on for the importance of school as a place a boy learns to stand on his own feet, away from family. The practice of separating children from parents is, of course, a common theme of the school story. In the Stalky Stories, which saw publication beginning in 1897, and in A Little Princess, 1911, we see the commonplace idea that children of officers and civil servants in India must be sent home for education before they return to India as members of the Raj. The trajectories are seen disparately for boys and girls, as before. Sarah Crewe is sad that she must leave her father and her home, but acknowledges that the training she receives at home will prepare her for her life as an adult Englishwoman in India. The Stalky boys, by contrast, are wholly invested in their school life, and we do not see them during the holidays, reflecting Kipling's schoolboy status of being essentially homeless during the holidays due to his parents' residence in India and his lack of relatives in England. The early separation of children from families is a practice that probably seems strange to us now. Kipling was not unusual in being sent to England at age 4 and not seeing his parents for more than 5 years after that. But it is also strange to British people living now and looking back at the practice in hindsight. In fact, the heyday of the public school, the institution that enabled and required this breaking up of families, coincided with the Empire's staffing needs. So we 21st century readers can understand this practice and its attendant ideologies as directly connected to the economic needs of imperialism. In being separated from their families so young, and spending so much of their formative years in the company of their peers and away from women and girls, boys were prepared for army life as well as for life in the Indian civil service, both of which jobs required separation from loved ones, easier to bear if one's primary emotional attachments were to peers rather than to women or children. In thinking about how the Stalky Stories and A Little Princess handle the enforced separation of families, we can understand much about how the ideology of the day shaped attitudes toward men and women. Sarah, we might note, has many of the characteristics of a gentleman. She is honest, helpful, and brave. She conducts herself as a princess, we might as well say gentleman, no matter what her apparent outside circumstances, reminding us that gentlemanly behavior flows from an internal spring of virtue. That's why, for instance, Bunter will never be a true gentleman. His internal spring offers only self-interested action, not virtue. Sarah is clever enough to understand how to handle her adversary, Miss Minchin, and she is also smart enough to understand illegitimate uses of power, the only mode of power Miss Minchin understands, with its favoritism, injustice, and cruelty. But her trajectory is not, in fact, back to India, as it is with the boys. Instead, she is headed practically next door, back into the arms of a loving replacement father who brings India to her in the form of Ram Das and various Indian artifacts. Just as in The Governess, school time is a time of exile, and the happy ending rejoins Sarah to family and home, albeit not her original ones. In Stalky, by contrast, each story develops a skill that will aid the boys' survival in the army after school leaving. The relations the boys form with one another are the most important relations of their lives. In the concluding story, the family steps away so that the really important relationship between the old boys can take precedence. The trajectory of the stories, which might seem to be toward the military academy, is in fact toward the reunion of the final story, when readers learn what the boys knew all along, the essentially practical nature of their education at the Call, the most important aspects of which took place outside the classroom. The Magnet stories we read were published in 1929 and 30. By this time, the British Empire was truly on its last legs. Ireland, for instance, had gained independence in 1922, and India would become independent in 1947, just two important moments in the breakup of the empire in the 20th century. Thus, the Magnet stories operate in the realm of nostalgia and wish fulfillment to some extent. They represent a world that is going away, a loss for some members of society. But they also occupy a moment in British history when the economic system was in flux because of this loss of empire. Among the challenges for British society was how to accommodate people whose status would no longer derive from family or from positions in a racial hierarchy enacted in imperial possessions. The school at this time became a place when one could become a gentleman. That is, a place where boys with no particular claim to being gentlemen could go to acquire the attributes of gentlemen, which they hoped would ensure their success in the still hierarchical world of Great Britain. The readership of the Magnet included boys in schools like Greyfriars, but by far the vast majority of readers were boys at grammar schools, in other state schools, and even in work, boys without a gentlemanly antecedent anywhere in sight. Stories like the Magnet stories provided instruction in how to behave as a gentleman, and how not to behave, which is Bunter's job, and simultaneously comforted people living through times of great change with their nostalgic view of a world in which, because a gentleman said so, it must be true. In the exam review forum, you'll have the opportunity to write about the evolution of school ideology over the period we've covered in this class. How does the ideal of a gentleman evolve from Tom Brown to Harry Wharton? To what extent is a character like Smithy a better form of gentleman for the 20th century? And why do the stories continue to elevate Harry Wharton's form of gentlemanly behavior? How does introducing gender or race into the equation change things? Why does Tom Brown's father list Englishman, gentleman, and Christian as the attributes he desires for his son? And what happens when those roles are out of bounds because of gender, race, ethnicity, or religion? And perhaps most importantly, how does the ideology of the gentleman enable the economic system of late 18th to early 20th century Britain?